The word Sowens, actually pronounced Sewan, comes from the Gaelic word sug, meaning juice. It was first documented in Scotland in the 1500s. This was a time when Yule was recognised and was gradually becoming a Christian celebration in Scotland, right before the country split from the Catholic Church during the Scottish Reformation, and all thoughts of Yuletide or Christmas was sadly banished after 1640. So Hogmanay, or New Year's Eve, became the focus of Scottish festivities during the end of December, a tradition which has prevailed. And this is probably also why Sowens are associated with being made and eaten around both Christmas and New Year's Eve. Sowens are fermented oat husks, which are drunk, often warm and sweetened in some way, or sometimes made into little cakes. Robert Burns suggests adding butter instead of milk to Sowens on Halloween in his poem of the same name, while many books relating to customs and traditions of Scotland cite them as being eaten at Christmas or New Year's Eve or Day. Sowens night was particular to Aberdeen and involved households coming together to share Sowens bread and cheese. This was on Yule's Eve, or on the 4th of January, the day before Twelfth Night, when Christmas was originally once celebrated. Recipes for Sowens vary hugely, from fermentation taking anywhere between 24 hours to a week. Some suggest cleaning the water during fermentation, others not. So we've taken our oat husks, sometimes were called sids, and what we've done is we've just added about the same amount of water again as to oats. And all we need to do now is to wait a couple of days and see what happens as they ferment. The recipe I use for my Sowens is from a book called The State of the Poor, which was published in 1797. The recipe, as with all Sowen concoctions, calls for oat husks, and I'm wondering if the process of removing the husks today from the actual grain is more thorough than it was hundreds of years ago, as after 4 days very little happened to the mix, except for turning the water slightly yellow, as you can see here in the middle jar. The thicker sour substance that most writers refer to is absent. But fortuitously, I did actually start an experiment much earlier in which I fermented rolled oats in water. So I'm now going to add some of the sieved starchy fermented oats to the watery looking fermented husks and see if that can help it along. So we've got the 4-day-old fermented oat husks or sids. Then this is what that looks like sieved. As you can see, it's just like clear yellowy water really. And this is the fermented kind of whole oats, which I have now been fermenting for about a week, and it really does smell like, I think you're supposed to get that really sour aroma, and it's quite thick because it's probably got a lot of the starch from the oats in it. So what I thought I'd do is add a little bit of that starch to the husk liquid, and just see if we can get a slightly better mixture. Right, so I'm going to leave that for another couple of days and see what happens. Okay, so several days after fermenting the oat and the oat husk mix, as you remember I put the two together, I have been left with this, with a sort of yellowy, well, kind of, I would say oat coloured, rightly so, sort of sediment that was in the bottom. So we only use the sediment, not all of that other liquid. Okay, so I'm going to boil that in a minute, but just to say, it's important to remember that this dish was for the labouring classes. It was a hearty gruel, a very hearty gruel. It would basically would have sustained folk on cold evenings or cold mornings, and the sediment could also be used to make small cakes, or used sometimes as a substitute for sour milk in baking. And sometimes these little cakes, if you had a kind of strong enough sediment, you could either presumably bake or fry the cakes. And I've also read recipes where the sediment was almost like up to a blancmange state, and it could be put into a mould and made solid. So I've no idea how this is going to turn out. And what I need to do now is add some water, probably about the same again of water, and then it suggests boiling it for between half an hour and an hour. So I think we'll better come back a bit later. Let's see what happens. Okay, so after about 25 minutes of cooking, we can see that we've got quite a gelatinous kind of texture now, and I can see why the Sowens were predominantly drunk warm as a hearty staple. And the smell actually that is emanating from these now cooked up fermented oats is quite disgusting, and it tastes pretty vile too, I have to say. But still, this was a dish for the poor, and yeah, as I mentioned before, it was used in other ways, so it could be solidified and used for other purposes. And I think what I'm going to do is see if this does get a bit thicker as it cools, and then yeah, so but basically that is your Scottish Sowens for Christmas, Halloween apparently, and of course New Year's Eve or New Year's Day. Scrummy. My final dish of Sowens. Definitely a blancmange, well, a thick blancmange texture now, as it cooled. So I know what all the books are talking about now, even though I never thought it would happen. And I know I said that it didn't taste that nice when I was cooking it on the stove. But I have to say, as it's cooled, it's got more pleasant. And I think with some salt or sugar or treacle, which I know people did used to use, I can definitely see the appeal. A bit like a sort of thick, solid, sour porridge. Anyway, quite pleased with this one. Wishing everyone a healthy and happy new year ahead. Thank you all for watching and for your continued support. Here's to a 2021 filled with more food tubing historic adventures in a slightly less frightening modern world.